This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 376 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before diving into today's questions, I want to let you guys know that for this Sunday's Champions for Charity golf match featuring Tiger Woods and Tom Brady on one team and Phil Mickelson and Peyton Manning on the other, FanDuel Sportsbook has you covered. For new users, FanDuel is running an incredible odds boost on the match. If you sign up for FanDuel Sportsbook right now, you can bet either duo at an insane 10-1 odds. That's a $100 payout on a max bet of $10. If you're ready to claim your 10-1 odds boost and you're located in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or Indiana, just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app and be sure to sign up with my promo code MATCH. That's FanDuel Sportsbook, promo code MATCH. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. First online wager only. Must wager in designated offer market. $10 minimum first deposit required, $100 max bonus. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER, and in Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. The first question this week is an email that says, JJ, hope all is well. I hope all is well with you too. Have you identified any groups of players that are being highly overvalued or undervalued based on early average draft position data? This is basically just asking who your models have identified as busts and breakouts for this upcoming season based on people's perceived value of these players. Looking forward to hearing what you think. Thanks, Jimmy D. So I went over some of these players on Monday's show on insights that I discovered when I was building projections. So some of this will sound familiar, but I'm looking at best ball ADP here, and I'm looking at just the month of May. So this is post-draft ADP. But I'll give you 5 of each, 5 underrated and 5 overrated players, and I'll focus on the early rounds since most late round picks are tough to be overvalued. I won't go deep into the analysis side, but I'll at least give you an answer here. And this answer can absolutely change as we move forward through this summer, by the way. Now, from an undervalued standpoint, the first player that caught my eye in the early rounds was Miles Sanders. You've got Austin Eckler, Aaron Jones, Josh Jacobs, and Kenyon Drake all going ahead of Miles Sanders, when I'd probably put Sanders above each of those players, mostly because we saw the upside last year. If you're a believer like I am that the Eagles' backfield won't be split like we've traditionally seen under Doug Peterson, and we're more in store for what happened at the end of last year when Sanders balled out and had 3 top 10 performances across his final 5 games, then you've got to think that Sanders is undervalued. Juju Smith-Schuster is a pretty big value to me as well. I'm prepared for a bounce-back season for Juju with Ben Roethlisberger back under center. I'm also on Calvin Ridley for reasons that I talked about on the show earlier this week. So I think that he's a nice value. So that's 3 guys. Miles Sanders, Juju, and Calvin Ridley. Robert Woods at pick 49 is pretty wild to me, especially when compared to Cooper Kupp, who's going 20 picks ahead of him. Cooper Kupp is one of my overrated picks here, so I'll talk about him for a second. You have to be a little bit nervous about the fact that Kupp's production dipped when the Rams shifted to more 12 personnel last year, and that included a snap share that dropped by about 10%. And then the last guy that I'll say who's undervalued is Devontae Parker. He looked pretty good in my projections, as did Preston Williams. So I think that he's undervalued at his current cost. People aren't buying into what he did during the second half of last year, but I'm looking for upside. Now, on the overvalued end, I've got to start with Lamar Jackson. I'll be doing a show for Monday on Jackson's value in fantasy football after his record-breaking year last season. But here's a spoiler. He's overvalued. Austin Eckler's overvalued too, in my opinion, based on the stuff that I talked about earlier in the week. I already talked about Cooper Kupp. That's number 3. And here are 2 more names for you. Darren Waller and A.J. Brown. I love A.J. Brown. I talked about that earlier in the week. Consensus rankings on Fantasy Pros have A.J. Brown at wide receiver 17. But the best ball data that I'm looking at here over on bestball10s.com has A.J. Brown at wide receiver 14, right after DJ Moore and right before Juju Smith-Schuster. Brown's an awesome dynasty asset who you should be targeting, but you have to worry about the type of volume that he's going to see in that Titans offense. You have to also worry about the offense's overall regression and then his own regression in yards per target. And then with Darren Waller, I do have some volume concerns. So those are my picks with the early round guys or the earlier round players. Again, these can change, but that's where my head's at right now. This next question is from @JojoLewis567. JJ, on your recent podcast, you mentioned that you were concerned about Leonard Fournette's volume next year because Jacksonville tried to trade him this offseason. Question, why would this fact potentially limit his touches next season? Same player, same opportunity. Thanks. Yeah, I think this is a very fair call out. I wasn't super detailed when I said that, so I'm glad that you're bringing this up. Jay Gruden is the offensive coordinator in Jacksonville now. We don't know exactly how he's going to deploy Leonard Fournette this year. And let's be honest here, it's going to be hard for Leonard Fournette to simply maintain the type of market share numbers that he had last year. He had almost 86% of Jacksonville's running back rushes in 15 games with about an 18% target share. So of course, if he sees similar volume this year, he'd be a really good fantasy asset. Anyone with that type of volume and with the positive touchdown regression that's coming for him, anyone would be a good fantasy asset. But there's a new offensive coordinator. Volume could be distributed differently. And to the point about them wanting to trade him, it doesn't exactly give you a ton of confidence that he's going to see tons and tons of volume if the team was looking to get rid of that player. Yes, it's a business. Like, I think that you could easily argue that the market is overreacting about Leonard Fournette, that he's almost a value. But there are plenty of questions about his volume this season, especially since the workload last year was so dramatic and so good. This next question is from @KyleB999. Love the rewind episode last week. Thanks. How does being in a 14-team league change late-round quarterback strategy? Still worth it? Yeah, it's still worth it. You could argue it's a more effective strategy in a 14-team league. People seem to get fixated on the fact that 2 more quarterbacks are being started across leagues like this each week. But you've got more running backs and more wide receivers too. If anything, shallower leagues is where you'd get away with going early round quarterback more. Like if you're in an 8-team league, then that means that your team has to be really good in order for you to win. Every single team in that league is going to be good. So there's more of a need to win at every position. Of course, that also means that replaceability is higher. It's easier to find guys off the waiver wire, and you can wait forever at the position during your draft, so the opportunity cost equation changes too. But I think the argument is stronger for going early round tight end and quarterback in shallower leagues than it is in deeper ones because of those reasons, mostly supply and demand related reasons. Don't change the strategy if you've got 2 extra teams. This next question says, "Hey JJ, thank you by the way for always being so accessible." You're welcome, thanks. You are really awesome. Wow, thank you. You talked on the Wednesday Rewind episode about how that top tier might be worth it at the right value, but then the middle tier tight ends not really being worth it. I'd like to apply this concept this season. What would you say is that top tier this year? I know you're a little down on Ertz, so is he included in that tier? Is Mark Andrews? Anyone else? Matt. Yeah, so historically, for any of you who didn't listen to the Rewind episode this week, but historically, middle round tight ends suck. I did buy into some of them last year in some leagues, and I totally regretted it. The data screams at us that middle round tight ends aren't very good. And what I really mean when I say middle round tight ends, I'm mostly referring to the guys after the elite tier that seems to get formed every single year. So basically this season, my projections have Kelsey and Kittle in that tier. That's it. I wouldn't really consider Andrews, who's my tight end 3, a part of that tier. And as you mentioned, I'm not super high on Zach Ertz. But getting an elite tight end typically isn't my approach in fantasy football drafts. I almost always go late round tight end. And I like a lot of the later round tight end options this year, so that's going to be my go-to strategy once again. This next question is from @TylerStrong95. We know Baltimore is due for regression, but do any of their tertiary receiving options project out as surprising producers in spite of that? The only pass catchers in Baltimore who I'm interested in drafting in a normal fantasy league, so not a best ball league, the only pass catchers I want are Hollywood Brown and Mark Andrews. It's really hard to find volume for the secondary options in that offense. Even if you're a believer like I am that the Ravens are going to be a little bit more pass heavy this season. It's not that I think a player like Devin Duvernay can't emerge and be relevant in fantasy. It's just that I think that it might not be evident right away. And that's the type of player that you can usually find on the waiver wire. I'm down with Marquise Brown. I've got Mark Andrews as my tight end 3. But outside of that, it's hard to buy into Miles Boykin or Duvernay or anyone else in that passing attack when we're likely looking at fewer than 500 pass attempts on offense this season. This next question is from @UncleJeff. Colts head coach Frank Reich's comments about a 1-2 punch with Mack and Taylor, plus saying Hines will get 10 plus catches a game. Has to be all coach speak, right? or do the numbers support this three-headed running back hydra? Okay, so let's first look at history here. Since 2011, we've had 24 running backs selected in the second round of the NFL draft. This does not include this year's draft because we don't have any data on this year's running back since the season hasn't happened yet. Among those 24, the average rush attempts per season is 112. And that includes 3 players who didn't even play their rookie season because of injury. Take them out, and that average jumps to 129 rush attempts. And then with targets, they've averaged 25 per season with those guys and 28 without them. Their running back rush share is 35%, and this is without the 3 players that were injured, while their target share is 5%. Basically, this just says what we already know, and that's that Jonathan Taylor is likely to be involved in some way. Second-round running backs are usually involved in some way, shape, or form. The majority of running backs drafted in the second round have seen at least 100 carries during their rookie season. We may think that running back talent isn't that big of a deal. Running backs in the NFL are relatively replaceable, so it's easy to just push aside talent and not worry about it much in fantasy football. But talent is still going to drive opportunity at the position, and opportunity means everything. Even if the difference between Jonathan Taylor and Marlon Mack for the Colts won't be that significant for the Colts team itself, a coach can see talent discrepancy and say, we can't take Jonathan Taylor off the field. And if they can't take Jonathan Taylor off the field, he's going to score a lot of fantasy points. And I think that's a very real possibility here. Marlon Mack is good, but he's not Jonathan Taylor good. Jonathan Taylor is one of the best running back prospects, at least analytically, that we've seen over the last decade. It's unfair to say that Marlon Mack is just as good. Or I should say it would be unfair to at least not recognize the crazy amount of talent upside with Jonathan Taylor. Maybe the intent is to split the backfield on early downs, but my expectation is that Jonathan Taylor will eventually emerge. But I should be clear, historically, the numbers aren't totally on his side to be a workhorse in year 1. Among round 2 and round 3 running backs over the last 9 seasons, only 5 of them had 200 or more carries during their rookie year. That's 5 of 50 or 10% of the players. I just see Taylor as that elite of a prospect where it's reasonable to think that he can be in that 10%. Now, the thing about Nyheim Hines, I don't want the quote that was said and that I read to be twisted. He didn't say that Hines would see 10 plus catches per game. He said, quote, it wouldn't surprise me if there's a game this season that Nyheim Hines has 10 catches. He's not projecting Hines for 160 catches. He's saying there could be a game where Hines catches 10 balls because of Phillip Rivers' tendency to throw to the running back position, which is something that I've outlined a few times on this show. Rivers' teams have ranked in the top 6 in running back target share in 6 of the last 9 seasons, and they've been in the top 3 in 5 of them. Personnel can dictate this, though, and Rivers has had some really good pass catchers to throw to in the backfield. So this is likely not all on Phillip Rivers, but I do think that we see a bump in target share to the running backs in the Colts offense. What I do think Reich's comments about Hines tell us, though, is that Jonathan Taylor's year 1 pass catching ceiling might be capped. We can go back and forth talking about Taylor's pass catching ability, but if the Colts use Hines, that inherently limits Jonathan Taylor's upside, period. So those are my takes on this backfield. I think Taylor's talent will be undeniable for early down work, but I do worry a little bit about what his pass catching ceiling might look like. This last question is from @FFMZ1234. Kevin Stefanski moving to coach the Browns has huge implications for Nick Chubb. Should he now be considered a top-tier RB1 in the Derrick Henry range? Does Dalvin Cook take a slight blow to his usage because of Stefanski leaving? I think this is a very good example of probably overstating offensive coordinator data. First off, our sample size for Kevin Stefanski is small. I think he's going to want to run an offense that's schematically similar to what we saw in Minnesota. But to take that to the next level and say that Nick Chubb is going to have Dalvin Cook-like numbers, I think that's a little bit extreme. I mean, realistically, this question is asking whether or not Nick Chubb can see a target share like Dalvin Cook's. Because Chubb's rushing share last year was one of the best in football. It's hard to really get any better than the 4th best running back rush share in the league. So this is about target share. Chubb had a sub 10% target share in 16 games, and that number was worse when Kareem Hunt was back in the mix. Dalvin Cook played 14 games, and he had a 14.3% target share. But this is where I think that we can overstate the Stefanski effect. I'm not saying it's impossible for Chubb to get more work as a receiver, but Dalvin Cook wasn't competing for targets with a Kareem Hunt level running back last year. You have to factor in personnel when you're looking at this stuff. And just in general, the Vikings saw game scripts last year that the Browns are unlikely to face this year. The scheme may look similar, but who's accumulating points and how they're accumulating points, that's where things can look different. Like, it's fine if you want to put Nick Chubb in Derrick Henry's tier. The way those two guys compile points in fantasy football is likely going to be similar this year. But I don't think it's because of Kevin Stefanski. Nick Chubb was already getting a lot of work on the ground, even when Kareem Hunt came back last season. Maybe not to the degree that we saw pre-Hunt, but it was still strong. And actually, Chubb's per-game running back rush share with Kareem Hunt last year was 70%. Dalvin Cook's in games where he finished was 63%. Now, some of this has to do with game script and the Vikings resting Dalvin Cook, all of that, sure. But let's not pretend that Dalvin Cook's rush share was so dramatically different than Nick Chubb's, even with Kareem Hunt. So again, this comes down to receiving. And to me, the bigger deal is that Nick Chubb has Kareem Hunt in that backfield for the entire season. Dalvin Cook never had a Kareem Hunt type running back. Can Nick Chubb see more receiving volume even with Hunt? Sure. Am I going to dramatically bump him up because of Kevin Stefanski being the Browns head coach? No. Personnel should be driving those decisions more than a small sample coaching tendency. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I hope that you're all staying safe, and I'll talk to you next week.